KaraokeBooks.
The Adventures of Ferdinand, Count Fathom. Tobias Smollett. Audiobook. Chapter 56. In which his fortune is effectually strangled. The last resource, and that upon which he least depended, was the advice and assistance of his old friend the empiric, with whom he still maintained a slight correspondence, and to whose house he steered his course, in great perplexity and tribulation. That gentleman, instead of consoling him with assurances of friendship and protection, faithfully recapitulated all the instances of his indiscretion and misconduct, taxed him with want of sincerity in the West India affair, as well as with want of honesty in this last marriage, while his former wife was alive, and, finally, reminded him of his notes, which he desired might be immediately taken up, as he, the quack, had present occasion for a sum of money. Ferdinand, seeing it would be impracticable to derive any succor from this quarter, sneaked homewards, in order to hold a consultation with his own thoughts, and the first object that presented itself to his eyes when he entered his apartment, was a letter from the tradesman, with his account enclosed, amounting to £45, which the writer desired might be paid without delay. Before he had time to peruse the articles, he received a summons, in consequence of a bill of indictment for bigamy, found against him in Hicks Hall, by Sarah Mudie, widow, and, while he was revolving measures to avert these storms, another billet arrived from a certain attorney, giving him to understand that he had orders from Dr. Buffalo, the quack, to sue him for the payment of several notes, unless he would take them up in 3 days from the date of this letter. Such a concurrence of sinister events made a deep impression upon the mind of our adventurer. All his fortitude was insufficient to bear him up against this torrent of misfortunes. His resources were all dried up, his invention failed, and his reflection began to take a new turn. To what purpose, said he to himself, have I deserted the paths of integrity and truth, and exhausted a fruitful imagination, in contriving schemes to betray my fellow creatures, if, instead of acquiring a splendid fortune, which was my aim, I have suffered such a series of mortifications, and at last brought myself to the brink of inevitable destruction? By a virtuous exertion of those talents I inherit from nature and education, I might, long before this time, have rendered myself independent, and, perhaps, conspicuous in life. I might have grown up like a young oak, which, being firmly rooted in its kindred soil, gradually raises up its lofty head, expands its leafy arms, projects a noble shade, and towers the glory of the plain. I should have paid the debt of gratitude to my benefactors, and made their hearts sing with joy for the happy effects of their benevolence. I should have been a bulwark to my friends, a shelter to my neighbors in distress. I should have run the race of honor, seen my fame diffused like a sweet-smelling odor, and felt the ineffable pleasure of doing good. Whereas I am, after a vicissitude of disappointments, dangers, and fatigues, reduced to misery and shame, aggravated by a conscience loaded with treachery and guilt. I have abused the confidence and generosity of my patron. I have defrauded his family, under the mask of sincerity and attachment. I have taken the most cruel and base advantages of virtue in distress. I have seduced unsuspecting innocence to ruin and despair. I have violated the most sacred trust reposed in me by my friend and benefactor. I have betrayed his love, torn his noble heart asunder, by means of the most perfidious slander and false insinuations, and, finally, brought to an untimely grave the fairest pattern of human beauty and perfection. Shall the author of these crimes pass with impunity? Shall he hope to prosper in the midst of such enormous guilt? It were an imputation upon Providence to suppose it. Ah, no. I begin to feel myself overtaken by the eternal justice of heaven. I totter on the edge of wretchedness and woe, without one friendly hand to save me from the terrible abyss. These reflections, which, perhaps, the misery of his fellow creatures would never have inspired, had he himself remained without the verge of misfortune, were now produced from the sensation of his own calamities. And, for the first time, his cheeks were bedewed with the drops of penitence and sorrow. Contraries, saith Plato, are productive of each other. Reformation is oftentimes generated from unsuccessful vice, and our adventurer was, at this juncture, very well disposed to turn over a new leaf in consequence of those salutary suggestions, though he was far from being cured beyond the possibility of a relapse. On the contrary, all the faculties of his soul were so well adapted, and had been so long habituated to deceit, that, in order to extricate himself from the evils that environed him, he would not, in all probability, have scrupled to practice it upon his own father, had a convenient opportunity occurred. Be that as it may, he certainly, after a tedious and fruitless exercise of his invention, resolved to effect a clandestine retreat from that confederacy of enemies which he could not withstand, and once more join his fortune to that of Rinaldo, whom he proposed to serve, for the future, with fidelity and affection, thereby endeavoring to atone for the treachery of his former conduct. Thus determined, he packed up his necessaries in a portmanteau, attempted to amuse his creditors with promises of speedy payment, and, venturing to come forth in the dark, took a place in the Canterbury stage-coach, after having converted his superfluities into ready money. These steps were not taken with such privacy as to elude the vigilance of his adversaries, for, although he had been cautious enough to transport himself and his baggage to the inn on Sunday evening, and never doubted that the vehicle, which set out at 4 o'clock on Monday morning, would convey him out of the reach of his creditors, before they could possibly obtain a writ for securing his person, they had actually taken such precautions as frustrated all his finesse, and the coach being stopped in the borough of Southwark, Dr. Fathom was seized by virtue of a warrant obtained on a criminal indictment, and was forthwith conducted to the prison of the King's Bench, yet, not before he had, by his pathetic remonstrances, excited the compassion, and even drawn tears from the eyes of his fellow passengers. He no sooner recollected himself from the shock which must have been occasioned by this sinister incident, than he dispatched a letter to his brother-in-law, the councillor, requesting an immediate conference, in which he promised to make such a proposal as would save him all the expense of a lawsuit and trial, and, at the same time, effectually answer all the purposes of both. He was accordingly favored with a visit from the lawyer, to whom, after the most solemn protestations of his own innocence, he declared, that, finding himself unable to wage war against such powerful antagonists, he had resolved even to abandon his indubitable right, and retire into another country, in order to screen himself from persecution, and remove all cause of disquiet from the prosecutrix, when he was, unfortunately, prevented by the warrant which had been executed against him. He said he was still willing, for the sake of his liberty, to sign a formal renunciation of his pretensions to Mrs. Fathom and her fortune, provided the deeds could be executed, and the warrant withdrawn, before he should be detained by his other creditors, and, lastly, he conjured the barrister to spare himself the guilt and the charge of suborning evidence for the destruction of an unhappy man, whose misfortune was his only fault. The lawyer felt the force of his expostulations, and though he would by no means suppose him innocent of the charge of bigamy, yet, under the pretext of humanity and commiseration, he undertook to persuade his sister to accept of a proper release, which, he observed, would not be binding, if executed during the confinement of Fathom. He therefore took his leave, in order to prepare the papers, withdraw the action, and take such other measures as would hinder the prisoner from giving him the slip. Next day, he returned with an order to release our hero, who, being formally discharged, was conducted by the lawyer to a tavern in the neighborhood, where the releases were exchanged, and everything concluded with amity and concord. This business being happily transacted, Fathom stepped into a hackney coach, with his baggage, and was followed by a bailiff, who told him, with great composure, that he was again a prisoner, at the suit of Dr. Buffalo, and desired the coachman to reconduct him to the lodging he had so lately discharged. Fathom, whose fortitude had been hitherto of the pagan temper, was now fain to reinforce it with the philosophy of Christian resignation, though he had not as yet arrived to such a pitch of self-denial as to forgive the counsellor, to whose double dealing he imputed this new calamity. After having received the compliments of the jailer on his recommitment, he took pen, ink, and paper, and composed an artful and affecting epistle to the empiric, imploring his mercy, flattering his weakness, and demonstrating the bad policy of cooping up an unhappy man in a jail, where he could never have an opportunity of doing justice to his creditors. Nor did he forget to declare his intention of retiring into another country, where he might have some chance of earning a subsistence, which he had so long toiled for to no purpose in England. This last declaration he made in consequence of the jealous disposition of the quack, who he knew had long looked upon him in the odious light of an interloping rival. However, he reaped no benefit from this supplication, which served only to gratify the pride of Buffalo, who produced the extravagant encomiums which Fathom had bestowed upon him, as so many testimonials of his foes bearing witness to his virtue.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.